Well, let me begin by adding my thanks to Brian. It's a wonderful occasion that you put on here, and I do know from experience how much work this kind of thing takes. I think it's not only an act of generosity, but an act of critical intelligence to do this kind of thing from time to time, because certainly I know that for myself, even in the short space we've been together, I've learned to hear people differently than I've heard them before, and actually almost everybody here in the room has either read in the series that Brian mentioned that I run in my backyard on an occasional basis, or has read at events like this that I've organized myself at USC and elsewhere when I was at USC. So, you know, these kinds of comings together seem to me a rare and generous part of what LA poetry scene has been in my experience, which is about as long as Andrew's, actually, about 15, 16 years. I began my process of transplantation, which I think everybody who's spoken has talked to one degree or another about being transplants in LA rather than Angelinos. My own began in Dublin, which, as you probably know, has a renaissance about every month. Usually inspired by the presence of one American academic looking for a thesis, or another American academic looking for a book, around which, you know, a bunch of Irish poets will congregate in a bar one evening, and that will be the latest renaissance. So obviously that was a place to flee, and maybe I saved myself by becoming an American academic. But in certain respects, my experience in most cities that I've lived in for any length of time has been that poetry scenes tend to be quite exclusive, balkanized, I think was one term that came up, that place enormous pressures on people to conform to one or other kind of work. I certainly found that in Cambridge as a student. I found that in San Francisco Bay Area when I taught there for a while. But in LA, there has seemed to me to be a remarkable degree of something that I wouldn't want to call eclecticism, because that sounds like it's too contingent, but a degree of openness and generosity to the kinds of endeavors that people are engaged in, no matter where it's leading them, which makes the whole notion of the avant-garde seem to me superfluous, because avant-garde suggests that there is one avant, and you are the avant-garde of that avant. Whereas in fact what I'm finding in Los Angeles, which has been for me one of the most productive places I've lived in terms of actually writing, that sense is really superfluous and unnecessary, and I think, you know, what's happening here today is part of that. I would say that I have a peculiar relation, being Irish, to the whole issue of race that came up earlier this morning that I did want to sort of touch back on, because when you're Irish, you're raised differently in different places. And one of the motivations for my own poetry, having begun to write in Ireland and then spent time in Cambridge at a time when it was going through its own renaissance, a renaissance that actually is still in a certain sense creating waves, was to feel that whatever I was doing was coming out of a different space that people there were familiar with or even interested in. And I remember giving some, you know, juvenile work to a teacher who's now one of the best-known avant-garde poets writing in Britain, and receiving, amongst other things, and what was really quite a generous letter, the remark, "You have yet to learn the imperial, the necessary imperial poet." And of course, as an Irish person living in England in the late 70s, this was a real stimulus of a very negative kind. And in some respects, my own practice since then has been to try to explore the lyric space as a space of undoing imperium. And by that I mean, many of my friends in Ireland whom I respect most as poets, people like Trevor Joyce, people like Maurice Scully, Catherine Walsh, and others, at a certain point in the late 70s had simply decided to abandon the lyric as a particular mode of writing, for reasons that have to do with what is in fact in the sort of Anglophone world, the general sense of lyric as the experiential mode of self-expression that is united in the end by a savvy metaphor that pulls all the different strands of feeling or of experience together, which was, of course, you know, the mode that Irish poets were writing in, usually with a little agricultural twist to give it authenticity and bogland truth, you know. But for myself, that's never been what lyric is about. I mean, for me, lyric is really the space in which the subject is not, and I agree with Christine here, not split, but suspended among different impulses that usually throw the subject into suspension, into danger, into uncertainty. The terrain that is a desire of violence, of loss, or death. And the language that accompanies lyric, it seems to me, is not a language of unification, but something governed. I think here of the phrase that Pound quotes without full recognition of its implications from Basil Bunting in the ABC of Reading, where he says, dichten equals condensare. And I'm very interested in that formulation, but only through reading it in a kind of Freudian way, to think about the language of condensation as the layering of different languages on one another, always in association with the displacement that layering also produces. And I think that there's a vein of lyric, and I don't know how to talk exactly about my own work in relation to this, but let me just say what I find compelling in certain forms of lyric, which for me have mostly been not the kinds of lyric that are associated with the experiential lyric that's common here and in Ireland and in Britain and so forth, but rather more continental European understanding of lyric as a space of dispersion of the subject. You know, it's good to follow both Daniel and Christine, because I think of the work of language in the poem not so much as a gathering in, as a process of splay, or a process of frame, where if you think about philology or even folk etymology, one of the things that it's doing is not producing a sense of origins and history, but rather producing a sense of the way in which words work across a space. And every invocation of a word can set up different tracks or different relays of meaning, if you like. And that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, both in poems that I've been reading and to some extent in what I'm writing. Because what I'm, in a way, trying to explore is the way in which every domain of language, which usually refers to a kind of discrete space that the subject inhabits at different moments, as for example, we inhabit our space of work, or we inhabit our space of erotic play, or we inhabit our space of pleasure in reading, or we inhabit the space of loss and mourning, or whatever. But words don't belong in any of those particular domains. And in a certain sense, I think the project that Christine is working on is a very fundamental exploration of the ways in which that takes place at the level of the syllable, or the ways in which Daniel is thinking about hearing and mishearing. For me, a very important part of this process is the continual stumbling into invention by mishearing, where a language that you are appropriating, a language that you are overhearing, goes awry, for me often, because I've lived through many different accent domains in my life and very different language domains. And that process of mishearing becomes actually a constitutive part of one's own sense of strangeness or of alienation in a space. So I'm just going to read the sequence that just got published in Dublin in this online press. They do kind of online chapbooks for the Readers Press. It's worth looking at because he's done a range of interesting kind of work there. And then I'm going to read just a handful of poems that I'm still working on, so they're very provisional and may a little change. The sequence is called Codolith. I don't know if there's any visual artists here. I know there's some Cal Arts people, but Codolith was a very short-lived mode of producing graphic work that has probably been chased out by things like Photoshop. Codolith, the word itself is a condensation of Kodak and lith, meaning stone. So it was a form of lithography, which was done by stripping in a negative that had been printed on plastic sheets onto the lithostone and then printing from there. And a lot of the kind of high contrast rock posters that you find from the 70s were done in Codolith. But for me, this obsolete form of printing has actually become a very interesting way of thinking about light writing on stone and the kind of contradictory relationship between light and stone. And I should perhaps mention that I grew up in a family of geologists in Ireland, and so if I have a relation to landscape, it's usually to try and think the deep structure of landscapes. For me, living in LA has been less about the blacktop and actually more about the underlying desert landscapes, which, coming from a place where it rains 250 days a year, has actually been a process of 15 years of learning to love this very alien rocky landscape. So the poem came together, and I think perhaps this is exemplary of the peculiar tension in lyric composition between what I would think of as construction and pondering. I had a bunch of notes that I knew were trying to become something that would be a poem, but I had no idea what to do with them and how to put them together into a poem until one night, and this rarely happens to me, one night I had a dream. And in the dream, I was stealing lines from my friend, the Irish poet Morris Scully, whose lines tend to be scattered all over the page in these books that he writes. He refuses to write poems, he only writes books. And in my dream, I reassembled the lines that I'd stolen from her in a little block in the middle of the page when I woke up, because it says at the end of the White Sargasso Sea, I knew what it was I had to do. So the poems are written in these blocks, and there's an epigraph which is giving back to Morris something of the lines I stole from him. So the epigraph is, "Where to?" said a voice. Then the voice went away, by which, as if time, in a sea of dark mood over the rocks, where there are no rocks, finishes you. That's from his poem, The Livelihood, and I should probably just say, whatever they will do to rocks, whatever they will do to you too. Fields. So livid a gleam along the rim, white winds descended from the shattering fields, runnels groove the mantle, the folded slab breaks down the gradient. Numbed in the song they sing, lay down the possibilities. Flesh knits its meshes into the grain of the stone. Dry wash. Dead wind off the Fang Range, strange weather, strange witness in the teeth of it, bit and grit in the fantail. Did you think we would leave and not leave, bone in the downdrift? Degrading, silting, grit angel, sweeping the wash with your wing. Petroglyph. Skin burrs, the thumbs impress the fibers, finding the grain of the stone. Such transfer, the light writing turned ghost flesh, mapped in stone. Did we remember the gifted one, the 4 staves of its opening? Nothing is given. It gives and is gone. Face. What the rock face encloses, my skin imprinted with its warm relief. Sugar lift, pock marks. Open the stone book. Light etches its ridges. The furrow archive sanded away. Scar tissue stares into the tender slate. Rock breaks the living. The living wrap stone with all their new brutalities. Root, blast, frack. In the breaker's yard, bodies bend in the wind. We rattle their bones in the crown of a hat. We raffle the mantle. It shears like the sea on the shore of the living. Spine. Januarized runnels bear down, open back into this thing they carry forward. Acrid taste of burnt treacle or some other unworldly afterglow. Failed wings at the shoulder, shrug pain to the floor. It slips down from the spine. Easy. Easy on. Casket. Hurt bleeds into another's rib, another beat, a casket sealed into the cleft for future incubation. Lidless eye turned into the handprint, fixed in sand. Night, compact, pressed into the socket. Think it a fold, a wrinkle, gray in the skin. Salt. Salt ventures underfoot, a thread trodden back into the slab, dulled savor to the tongue, reminding a plain wind dresses the stone. Histories scored into its face. It stands out from the dark room, white remnant of the promised flight. What you do give to be of. Vitruvian. Vitruvian, ridiculous. Braced in the crevice, the aperture shrinks your horizon. Black marble curtains for you. Quartered in stone, water drawn, hacked into with light piers, the white bits ciphered across the slab, percussed, sprung. Prison. A thing breaks beyond naming. In the grit depot, in the shingle archive, blood meets with its congealing. Your debrided palm greets the horizon. Sky prison shredding the light face, late into the farness, into the violet wash, over fracture and fold. Copestone. The coping weighs on his shoulder. Turn at a stroke to the eyeball welled up with minding. What if the thing should sing then? Sing out from the knot rim, spelling with numbers, a jabber flush to the finish. You're a history. Drakes sweep the place of its leadings. Chamber. Some pause and then resume. Erratic rock, adrift on the mantle. What are you doing here? Stone chamber, voided with stone. The burden bears down on the bone. Shin ache, joint skew. Come dance with me into the black sight. Come sing with me into the dry dark, into the wind's teeth. Ad lib, ad lib, ad lib. That's cool. So I wanted to just read a few poems that are in progress. A sequence, at the moment it's called Bar Null. Maybe because there are no bars in LA like there are in Dublin, which is a school for poetry for Irish poets. And it's subtitled Epistrophes. You may know that word from Monk's famous piece, Epistrophe. But actually an epistrophe is something which turns around. And in a way, these pieces are all turning around, or I think they're going to be all turning around an absence. They're elegies in a certain respect. And that notion of an epistrophe seemed to me right to describe the genre that they belong to. I guess that would be for now. All the waves arrive bereft of their refugees. The trees abolish even their ruins, amassed in the chamber of zeros. There is nothing there to be filled. You could grow learned in knots, study the accumulation of chalks. That too is waiting, teller of shames and of dream works. Long swells laid up against dismay, the sack on your shoulders slouching downward off the stone paths, a head full of brittle figures, relic echoes on a junkyard of remnants and refuse. Things are the discards of your philosophy, dismissed, demented, detained. They drift off into the half-light, unapt, ungrounded. You carved this voice out of my body, dislodged, as if it did not even belong there. Instruments laid out on the table, conductor of tunings, your one note hangs on the air. He should have died hereafter, whatever ever after he took on. These are no fit times to be dying in, though too many come to. Their leavings surround us with our needing. You know how we live in two worlds always, so this is written in divisible ink, as if there might have been a word for such a time. But he turned a keen, untroubled face home to the instant need of things, being all abstracted in body, aesthetic, and then so unwillingly cut into spirit. Off they go, scampering, light-fingered, streetwise from the law. That poem, by the way, is dedicated to the memory of Jose Munoz, the great queer theorist who died quite recently in New York. By word of mouth, or a stone fort opens its wings to the sea below, below. I miss you now, though there was nothing between us, only this great null of ocean and embrasure embraces. A selfie, peeled up from the rock, consumes from the edges. See how it burns. Round this end of time, sense certainty is circulating. The lone thing taken up into its sublime abstraction is your concretion or a Jerusalem stone facade. Redux, flattening 5 stories to one, say, such odds when the rat comes to your door. Cement dust, ash, blown along the X corridors. But to be partial to things, this desert is full of their traces in the attentive ear. Only word of mouth readies them in their much blamed persistence. Out of which of the divided skies will the bird next fly? Across the meridian, the new thing escapes me, there then not there. After a life of listening, all mixed up with things and things, the night voice steps your way. Yes, you will die your death, the cipher imploding inward to the dark and cosmic quiet. Another sky, another earth, that is but one condition of our being, the one annulled by noughts. They sold all the ashes. It wasn't enough yet. Multiplication of the dead ends, the irrational remains. Rain filled up the jug, then we guzzled what was left us. Cry for the bird on the remaindered sky. Oh, there was always something, all edges, asseverating. You have the body, it is the body I want in this gathering of the querulous. Always we come after the body that was spirited away. A dense word cluster tightens the knot in your gut. Remote and magical dusting takes on the impress. They keep finding traces rubbed out, rubbed in. They lift off the stone with their prints intact. It's still not the thing they want. The want stays. It may be the want you want, after all, after the body's been lifted, after the wanted are rendered into this afterlife that is the life of things. Something desperately signaling the body I want. Between lovely bluenesses, the horizon rules its edge, listening seawards. All round, blood in its milk, red moiré, ash gray streaking its milky silk. It pivots around the standing stone, pebble dress. A dot will do ya. The stone standing along the rim, a pine cutout, fog dodged, determines the limit you meet. A human looming maybe on the foreshore. A blade opens the distance, jottings shed from its sharp edge, seeding the cloud. Between there and here, it is light that is moving as light is made to. Skylight, sea light, ear enlisted to its wavelength, reduced to one note rung out, hardly there. I cast the white stones on the foreshore, quadrant, loaded with chambered echoes. Like you say, the loss of wind defines a grey room. Likewise, embers give birth to the absence of flame. Such bearing will suffer no hurt. Easy flow, easy dew. The sovereign is smooth and the runoff turns no stone, moving others as it will. Like a blue water clause, scale determines where you step. Beyond the limit, the center doesn't hold. Rhythm grows wildly and makes grooves of its own. Will you, won't you, want to now? We were speaking of power, of showy things and shit. The base is fourfold and still moves. It is not as things we shine, seated in solace. As things, we rise. I did mean to signal very quickly one LA poet who's not here and can't be here. He's Alfred Arteaga, a poet who ended his life up north, but who was very much part of the LA scene for a very long time. And Brian mentioned some books, and one of the books I have is actually his last volume that my own little press produced, so if anybody's interested, I